over to you, ma'am.
How do I advance the slides?
Yes, so we will give to you the pointer. And
Thank you. Well, thank you.
yes.
While the slides are coming up, I first want to, of course, thank the government of India for inviting me. I'm very honored. I was asked to give some of the setting the scene on CMS and CBD, which is a very tall order, and I shall do my best. I also want to thank the government of India and Mr. Das Gupta as well for the incredible organization, and of course the Secretariat. But this is an amazing conference center. The feeling is wonderful. We're here in Gujarat, and I'm sure with such good feeling and good organization, we'll have very good outcomes. It's also a dream to be here. And also, I took advantage of your amazing wildlife the past 6 days. So I am very mellow after several days in Nagaholli National Park. And I won't list all the wildlife I've seen because my colleagues may experience some jealousy. So I won't do that. And thank you very much. And what I'm going to do, try not to. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit, what is the Convention on Biological Diversity? I'm not going to use the word policy, I don't want to bore anyone, but these are really important issues. What is this post-2020 global framework that everyone's talking about? Why does it matter? And how does this relate to CMS? And how does it relate to migratory species? And how does it relate to all of you, to all of us, to all the stakeholders? So briefly, and I promise briefly, what is the Convention on Biological Diversity? Some of you, this was even before you were born, I'm frightened to say, but it was signed in June of 1992 in Rio by 150 governments. It entered into force as a treaty, meaning it was ratified by sufficient governments in 93, and 196 governments are parties. India signed it in 1992 and ratified it very early in 1994. All CMS party governments are parties to CBD. Absolutely. The opposite is unfortunately not true, but we can work on that. But every party who's here and making decisions this week is a party to CBD. So decisions made this week will hopefully drive then what those governments take forward in the CBD process. What is CBD about other than thousands and thousands of pages of documents? It's number one, the conservation of biological diversity. Number two, sustainable use of its components. And three, fair and equitable sharing of the benefits of the utilization of genetic resources. I won't get into that one, but biodiversity, of course, is at the core, as is sustainable use of its components. So what is this strategic framework? What are we talking about? The Convention on Biological Diversity in 2010, 10 years ago, in Nagoya, Japan, adopted targets for 10 years, called the Aichi targets. Well now, in 2020, those targets are up. Some have been almost met, some have been met, some not met at all. We have a biodiversity crisis. We can't just sit and talk about targets. We have to act, all of us. But this year in October in China, the parties to the CBD, which are all countries in the world other than 2, will adopt targets in a framework for the next decade. This decade is critical if we are going to save biodiversity and benefit people in local communities. And the UN General Assembly is likely to, I can't promise they'll endorse it, but they did last time and they will again. So this isn't just somehow a framework for CBD. This is a framework for the planet. This is a framework that will guide actions for the next decade by governments, by NGOs, by civil society, and by other stakeholders. It could not be more important to get it right. You all are aware of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, some of which expire in 2020, but all the governments of the world by consensus agreed on these. I prefer this way of looking at them. It's the same goals, but what underlies all sustainable development and poverty alleviation, health, education, equity, etc., women's issues are the biosphere, are the land, the water, the ocean, the air. And that's why it's so important that we get the biodiversity right if we are going to deliver on all of the sustainable development goals, if we're going to deliver on sustainable development. So what is the timeline? What's going on? Well, for this special year 2020, the first moment really is this conference here in India. This sets the stage and sets the scene for what will be decided. The two anchors really are this COP and the CBD COP in China in Kunming in October. In addition to what is recommended here to go forward, there will be an open-ended working group, one of the worst titles of a meeting, but it'll be a negotiating meeting, unfortunately not in China, but in Rome 2 days after this meeting concludes, and some of us, certainly all the governments most of the governments will be there. CBD will have a scientific and technical meeting in May. There will be a major UN Ocean Conference in June dealing with these issues. IUCN will have its Conservation Congress in June as well, also dealing with these issues. CBD will have its last formal negotiating conference in July, and then the Conference of the Parties. But I cannot stress enough how important it is that the issues around migratory species that we all care so deeply about here go forward through this entire process. So where does CMS fit in? Just to remind you, CMS was signed, as was said, in Bonn in 1979 and entered into force in 1983. 130 countries are parties. India was one of the original 15 and was the first Asian country to ratify the CMS. I don't know if everyone knows that, but India was the first country in Asia to ratify one of the original 15. What's important, it is the only treaty or intergovernmental organization established exclusively for the conservation and management of migratory species, avian, aquatic, and terrestrial. This is what we say, the only show in town, and it's absolutely critical. These are, sorry, I have to say that. These are the CMS parties. We wish the countries in green could turn to blue, and we will work on that, but all but 2 of those countries are also parties to CBD, extremely important. So I want to set the stage for the dialogue. I don't want to say what I think should happen, but we want to hear from all of you. How can CMS and the approach influence the post-2020 framework? How does this relate to migratory species? What about connectivity within intact ecosystems and between habitats as well, and the integrity of ecosystems and threatened species? And how can you engage? How can you engage with your governments, and how can you engage with other stakeholders? How can we work together to combat this biodiversity crisis? These 2 photos were taken 3 days ago in Nagaraholi, by the way. So migratory species are alive and well here. A lot of work is going on, a lot more work needs to be done, but I can attest that these were taken by someone else with a better camera than I have. What do we need to do to combat the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis and tie them together? Climate is a major threat to migratory species. How do we have high ambition? We have to stop business as usual. We have to change the approach to development, to consumption. We're here in a vegetarian state and conference center, and maybe the whole world should learn something from India. And how do we change our practices on trade, at the same time engaging stakeholders? This cartoon I found, if only the migratory species could sit in judgment on us, what would their conclusions be? So I want to end with a quote from Mahatma Gandhi, because we are here in Gandhinagar, that the future depends on what we do in the present. We can decide now what the future will be, and I urge everyone this week to take the spirit of Gandhi forward and help guide governments in their deliberations so that actions and decisions taken here and taken at the CBD will ensure a future for nature, for wildlife, and wild places here in India and across the globe. So thank you, and I look forward to hearing from all of you.